Okay, hi everyone. My name is Lance Logan. I'm a Whiskey House trustee. I'm going to be doing a presentation with Mike Woods here, where we're going to be doing our whiskey history at the Whiskey House. We're going to go over the presentation that we have kind of put together. It's going to be on how Nelson Greenbrier helped create Crown Royal.
Yeah, so this is Mike Woods. I'm a trustee at the Whiskey House. I'm also executive producer of the award-winning podcast Sip Suds and Smokes. This is a really fascinating story that Lance and I got to cover, and some of you may know the story about Nelson Greenbrier, but it's the part of the story that you don't get to hear if you go to the distillery or if you read about, and that is basically what happened kind of at the end of the life cycle for Nelson Greenbrier. So, really hope that you enjoy this story and feel free to follow back up with Lance or myself if you have questions. We'll make up plausible but yet entertaining answers. so,
Absolutely, yeah.
well, let's get right into it with the ship sank.
There, there it was. Yeah, so kind of the start of our story starts with John Philip Nelson, who was the father to Charles Nelson, who we'll speak a lot about. Um, it's kind of a fun story because John Philip was going to move his whole family over to the United States, and so they had sold off all their family wealth. And in his wanting to protect the wealth, he had taken all his gold bars and all the family wealth and had it sewn into his suit. And so then he boards the Helena Sloman, which is coming over. And kind of the fun fact about Helena Sloman is that it brought over two famous families on its previous trips, the Heinz Ketchup family and the Steinway Piano family. On the third trip, though, the one that Charles happened to be on, like it started to sink. It wasn't like going down fast, so they were able to like get uh, almost everyone off the ship. But the lifeboat that John Phillip happened to be on, though, hit some turbulence or something happened. He went overboard and wasn't able to be found. So the reason that's like kind of an important part of the story is he went overboard with all of their money. And so now this leaves us with Charles and his mother and siblings with nothing. And they have to literally start from zero when they get to.
So you're saying that ketchup doesn't float and pianos, or I'm sorry, ketchup float and pianos float, but apparently John didn't.
It doesn't. And so, but
The
yeah.
the strangest part about this story for me is that he's he he had the his golds was sewn into his clothing, and it's like, where do you go to a shop to say, hey man, I'd like to sew in the coins into my clothing itself, and thinking that that was a long-term idea to be on the water,
Mhm.
with just all this dead weight and be walking around with it. I mean, do you wear it all day or just when the boat is sinking, or I don't know. What are
Yeah.
the rules around
I
that?
mean, I would just assume it's like don't ever take your eyes off it. It's either in your arms, on your back, or you're wearing it. But I get it. You want to protect it, but I guess you're gonna protect it all the way to the end.
Hmm. So the ship sank, and John Phillips sank with his clothing and all the gold, and so we pick up the story there with Charles, right?
Yeah. So Charles, he's like the man of the family now. At 15, he's gonna have to uh, kind of take charge of everything. They end up in Cincinnati. He ends up being a butcher for a little while, and then eventually he transitions into moving to Nashville, where he opens a general market, kind of where he started seeing a lot of like the whiskey come into his businesses through this general market. Uh, he saw kind of like, hey, there's money to be made here, and I want to be a part of that. And so he uh, kind of shifted his focus towards building distilleries and trying to grow that side of the business. From what I can see, I think he had a hand in like five or six different distilleries throughout the course of his life. And they weren't all the same. And so it wasn't like he was just growing one. He had like multiple brands, which I thought was really kind of cool and interesting. Um, but you notice is that as you kind of research these, it's a lot of deals where he forms a partnership with one person and then it falls apart for whatever reason, or he forms
Hmm.
a partnership with someone else and then a fire burns the thing down, and then they have to decide, are we going to either rebuild it or are we just going to sell everything off and then part ways? And that kind of brings in like where the story kind of starts, where he's made deals with Mr. Sperry, W.H. Sperry, and that is a big partnership that he had.
So a couple of interesting things around this part of the story is who his neighbors are. So literally on the same block that you have right there in downtown Nashville on what was known as Market Street, now it's called Second Avenue, is you have Charles Nelson right there. You also have George Dickel, which is just across the street, and another key figure in Tennessee whiskey, which is Jack Daniels, which was actually a neighbor of his for a little while. Now, Charles actually moved around in between two or three buildings, as did many of those merchants that were there at the time. So one key figure was his brother Adolph. And so Charles had several siblings, but many of them were older and had actually moved out of the area or gotten married and were having children of their own. Adolph was the younger brother, and he was the one that really held the shop in place. So while Charles was actually going around and creating some of these additional businesses and working in the distilleries he was setting up, it was Adolph that was there at the store day in and day out. And so he meets this one pivotal partnership after building a distillery, a fire, building a distillery, a fire. He makes this deal with Sperry.
Yeah, and like Sperry and end up doing Bellmead Distillery, which was a, when we think about it now, like I, it's that's the hardest part for me, is to recognize and separate like what's happening right now today in 2024 versus what was happening back then, because Bellmead is known locally to us, but back then Bellmead was humongous. They were distilling so much. So uh, it talks about how in 1879 they paid the most tax revenue of all the distillers across the state of Tennessee. So either they were really bad at uh, taking and not, or really bad at avoiding the taxes, or they were humongous. But I'm going to say that they were huge at the time. And so they were like, that was my biggest takeaway, is that it was such a huge distillery. It was a big deal at the time. It was very well known. But of course, just like most of the other ones, there was a huge fire, and so that takes Bellmead and it,
Surprise,
yeah.
surprise.
And so they decided they weren't going to um, rebuild it, and so that's when they sell off all their assets. And what happens there is that actually the Sperry family is still the one who holds the trademark to the Bellmead distillery. So, and all the images and things that happened with like all the Bellmead liquors that are going on right now. So they still own it.
Yeah, so I think that was a very interesting choice that both Charlie and Andy made to actually launch a distillery that on a was on a brand that they actually did not own. Even though they had their own brand, to do something as Nelson, they actually chose to launch on something that was very early on, and so the relationship, is it almost has some symmetry because you have Charles actually coming out, starting, to release a whiskey that is not on his name. It's actually on Sperry's, Bell Mead, and so you actually have that history kind of repeating itself, with what Charlie and Andy chose to do as they were reconstituting the Greenbrier distillery itself. So it's fascinating, just when you think about that symmetry. But the thing that's going on is that you don't really have whiskeys that are distributed by a brand during this period of time. We're talking probably late 1800s here. And most of the whiskeys that were being sold in merchants like Nelson Brothers or Nelson Mercantile, were actually sold more by style. So you had things like Old Rutherford, or you had Lincoln County, and so the branding of a whiskey is a pretty rare thing. It's just not very widespread. When people would go in, they'd go, "Well, I want some Old Rutherford." They wouldn't say that I want most of the rye at that point. I'm sorry, most of the whiskey at that point in time was all rye whiskey. Bourbon came much later, and so it's really interesting that they really found a good partnership in the middle of all this disaster, because now you have the next part of the story, which is they kind of pick up the pieces and they start a new distillery.
Yeah, so Belle Meade burns down, and it kind of a fun part of history is they talked about Sperry talked about how it was fireproof and that they had brick on the outside and there was nothing, but whiskey and alcohol is flammable, so it doesn't matter while the brick isn't burning, everything else is. And so that was a just kind of a part where it's like, hey, and hindsight's 2020, but we probably shouldn't have told everyone that we had a fireproof distillery, because fires, yeah, they wreck. That's what happens. They wreck these distilleries back then. But what that really did is it allowed Charles Nelson to kind of develop Nelson Greenbrier, and 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 Nelson Greenbrier flourished. I mean, we're talking they went ahead and started being one of the largest distillers in Tennessee, uh, and it was like when all the stars align and things start coming together. Uh, that's like kind of what happened. It was he wanted Charles needed to move out of Nashville. He wanted something bigger. He needed to find a place where he could do more barrels, but that where the infrastructure was in place and the transportation and can moving these barrels around and everything could come in line, and it all did. He was able to find kind of an abandoned distillery from a previous company with some of the like just infrastructure and buildings. There's spring water and all these things. So he finds this area in Greenbrier. And then not only does he find it, he gets just a sweetheart of a deal. So we were able to find that he was able to buy the whole property with some buildings on it, with some machinery already in place for $3,600.
That's a good deal.
It's cheap. So fantastic. Then
So some really key things, about that particular choice. So he actually shopped around, in many places in Middle Tennessee. But so you have, two other major distilleries that are really making a lot of whiskey. The largest distillery about that period of time is actually Wartrace, which is in Rutherford County, very close to Murfreesboro in this day and age. And that is probably one of the most popular styles that's being made. Now, Old Rutherford was actually made at like 8 or 10 different distilleries at the time. And we'll talk a little bit about Josie Brown in a bit. The other large distillery was down in Lincoln County, which was George Dickel Distillery. Cascade Hollow was what it was called at that point in time. So when Charles was actually shopping around, there were a couple of things that he did not want to do. One, he didn't want to go toe-to-toe with those people in the same part of the state. And so having some geographic distance between each of those would enable him. But a key thing about creating any distillery at that point in time is water. And that was a key thing that this particular property has. It had a free-flowing spring. And so a good water source that he was going to be able to use on a perpetual basis was a real key, part of the equation. Plus he wound up with, some equipment and some buildings that were right there on site. He had a road, already that was built to be able to get into the property. So I'm not going to say it was turnkey, but it had a lot of the key pieces. And most importantly, it was within a riding distance of Nashville. So it could actually ride into Nashville about 2 to 3 hours from the distance, by horseback at that point in time. So a lot of key things having that particular piece of property.
Yeah. And so we kind of researched that there were like two big key things, but I couldn't find more information on it. And so they talked about he was able to uh, come up with this Kirk improved design, and like
Giant mystery.
right, and we can't figure out what that design was. What process did it improve on? What exactly was this? I couldn't find it, and so
Yeah, we were joking about what would be improved. Well, does that mean you're actually boiling from the top down and distilling, in a different move vertically? Did they put the tanks, horizontal, and actually fire it from left to right or right to left? Um, really not quite sure exactly what the Kirk, improved design was, but the main thing that Charles chose to do was he's gone through all of this trial and error. He's built a distillery, he has a fire. He's built a distillery, it has a fire. And each time he applied each of the lessons learned that he's gone through, that period of time as well. So the main thing he wanted to do, he wanted to make it big, and he definitely made it big.
right, he had room to produce more barrels per day than really anyone around him, which is again it just shows he's a big thinker, and he was always just going bigger and bigger, and he always talked about, if I mean, when I read on him, it was all efficiency as well. He just loved efficiency, and he's always looking on ways to increase that. uh Sounds like a great guy to me, in or maybe our brains think alike, because I'm the same way. And we also, at this time, they had just come out with the Tice meter, which was a way to tax all of these distilleries, um, to on the amount of liquid that they were producing. And so a lot of these distilleries were not happy, because not only did they have to pay extra taxes, I think it was like between $600 and like $2,000 to get this meter that had to be installed, so that way you could not only pay to have it installed, but then pay the government more money.
Who's your buddy?
Yeah,
Who's your friend?
yeah, it was
The federal government.
yeah, people
We're
were,
here to help.
yeah, they were very upset about that, and Charles was able to get around it. He got grandfathered or something to where he was able to produce more than these other distilleries without being handicapped. That because a lot of these other distilleries were, it was a pretty big loss for them to have to all of a sudden produce the same amount if they're at whatever capacity they're at. That all of a sudden it's just loss for them. And then, but he was able to kind of turn it into a positive for the distillery. Uh, and I mean, and he was doing, I think originally in Nashville, I think he got up to something like 20 barrels a day was about the max they did. And then when he got Greenbrier going, they were doing more than 100 a day.
Yeah, and so those other distilleries that I was talking about, while they were large, they they weren't producing that measure of volume. I think that they definitely had more rick house space at Cascade Hollow. I think that they were probably distributing more whiskey, out of war trays. But in terms of just sheer distillate that you were cranking out each day, Nelson Greenbrier, had everybody, almost 2 to 1. I mean, even those other distilleries, even to say they were doing 50 barrels a day would be a really tough stretch. So, so this is really kind of at a bit of transition point where, all of a sudden you have applied all these lessons learned, and the first time you're actually seeing the whiskey actually being produced as a brand. And so even the ceramic jug that you see here in the photo was kind of unusual. And I think a lot of this had to do with because he was a merchant, he was used to, kind of branding things in the store. So normally you would see the merchant brand on there, but in this case you have a ceramic jug actually with the brand of whiskey.
Yeah.
So the other key thing is that you see, the early stage of that very iconic trademark that in the font that was being used, back then on that shot glass that's in this photo as well, and shows you specifically, how well it was stylized, for that day and age as well. So that brings us to the next part of the story, which is all about the death. of Charles Nelson.
Yeah.
So Charles dies in 1891, and he was only 57, at the time, which, probably in that day and age was not terribly, I mean, it was average lifespan for a lot of men, especially. Um, really had a huge business empire that was going on during this period of time. And this was, fairly typical. I mean, if you look at some other iconic figures during this period of time, Manny Schwab definitely comes to mind, really had a lot of other business interests, outside the distillery. And so goes the same way, for Charles, because he not only did he was selling whiskey at wholesale, in addition to distributing it, directly on a retail basis. He started the Nashville Musical Union and was a banker as well with the Nashville Trust Company. So he had an awful lot going on. Again, Adolph was holding down the shop. And I'm sure that at this point in time, some of his kids were old enough probably to get involved, with actually, being at the store as well on a routine basis. But he wasn't, the distillery wasn't his own thing, at that point in time. So after Charles dies, this really prominent figure steps into the equation, and it's his wife, Louisa. And what a fascinating story, that a lot of people don't get to hear this part of the equation, not only for Nelson Greenbrier, but they don't actually get to hear, what happens after a lot of these iconic distilleries, their families kind of pick up the pieces and kind of move on. I want to talk about not only Louisa, but what happened to some other iconic figures, around this period of time as well. So Louisa had about a 19-year run, in actually overseeing everything at this point in time. So it wasn't like, I'm going to do this conveniently for 3 to 4 years and then sell it off or shut it down.
Yeah, and she grew the business. Like it was not like, oh, I'm just gonna try to like operate it or let it kind of keep just staying at the status quo. Like there's you can find patents with her. Like she was the one who actually patented the label, and so and at the time, women running businesses and setting up these trademarks and
Not very
patents
common.
didn't happen. And if they did, they actually would do it kind of under the guise of signing everything with their initials rather than that. So that way, the men could be like, oh, this was probably the man who was running this. But she was proud enough to put her full name on it, and she did things like she helped with these trademarks that we've been able to go back and find and patents and things. She was a business woman. She was not just like trying to stay above ground. She was growing it.
Well, I wanted to. So there were several women that were in a very similar, situation. So you have Louisa Nelson with Nelson Greenbrier, but you have two other women that are right in a very similar situation where their husbands have passed away. I talked a little bit earlier about Josie Brown, and she was the wife of the distiller for Wartrace Distillery, which is where they made Old Rutherford. And then you have Augusta Dickel, from the George A. Dickel distillery. By the way, the A stands for her, not for him. That was not his middle name. So if you didn't know that, where the A came from as well. So you have these three women, and they control just a huge amount of wealth. I mean, collectively at this period of time in the late 1800s, they're worth about $5 million. And in today's dollars, that's about $180 million that these three women have, that much net worth between the three of them.
I mean, they're overseeing like over
Huge wads,
75% of the alcohol in Tennessee.
easily. So, it's, I think that that's what's so tragic, in this part of the story to me is that while a lot of these men, created these very iconic distilleries, it was really the women or their families stepping in and enabling them to be so successful and gaining so much wealth. So I really, it's sad that history has not really acknowledged, these women well enough. That's probably the the horrible, the worst part, of this story is that they've been marginalized and not really acknowledged, for their accomplishments.
Yeah.
But so each of these women had a different outcome, though. So we talked a little about Louisa, stayed, and we're going to talk about the next steps with her. Josie sold off the distillery, and Wartrace completely vanished right in state. Now, Augusta with Dickel and with George Dickel and Company went through a transition where the brand moved to Stitzel-Weller. It was made there for a little while. Then it found its way being acquired and moved around, 2 or 3 times until the family said, fine, we'll just sell it. And, it wound up in the hands of this same place where this one, which was Shinley Industries. So during this period of time, there was something that was about to come into Tennessee, and that is Prohibition. Now, if you didn't know that Tennessee actually initiated Prohibition much earlier than it was done on a national basis. So it actually came to Tennessee in 1909. Well, what had been happening up to that point is there had been many different elements of the temperance movement where women, even some men, were very upset that alcohol was destroying the family structure in the U.S. Men would go out, they'd drink all night, they would come home, they wouldn't go to work. I mean, it was just all these, cultural elements of alcohol abuse, were rampant. And so, we'd screaming, at the politicians going, change this. This is destroying, our families. And they would come up with laws and they would present them and they would pass them, but then it would come to a final vote and it wouldn't pass. And this went on for probably 3 or 4 years in Tennessee.
So it wasn't probably my biggest take home as I learned more about this was that it was not like this just happened with a snap of a finger.
Right.
People could see it coming because
Very much so.
It wasn't going away. It was voted down, but it wasn't going away.
So in Tennessee, one of the key things that was going on is that so you have these distillers that are watching what's going on, and 2 key choices that were made. One was made by Manny Schwab, who owned George Dickel and Company. So he owned the distillery. He was banking on his ability of influencing the legislature such that Prohibition would never pass. And he continued to step up and lobby each time, that would come up until one fateful day when it came down to a gunfight right in front of the Hermitage Hotel on what we now know as Legislative Plaza. And the 2 men that were fighting were the 2 opponents over Prohibition, and the wrong guy died. So the one that died was the one that was trying to make it happen, and all the legislators were like, look, this is getting out of hand, And the key figure that actually moved to actually having Prohibition pass was actually the governor at the time. And up until then, he had vetoed the bill several times as it had passed both the House and the Senate in Tennessee. The governor would say, I'm sorry, it's not happening on my watch. Manny's my man. The thing that was going on with Louisa, she was watching all of this political drama play out, and she decided, I need to get the heck out of Dodge, and I need to move this operation to some place where I'm going to be able to operate legally. So about 1906, this is about 3 years prior to Prohibition actually being enacted in Tennessee, she decides, I'm going to move to Kentucky, and decides to head to Whiskey Row. And so she sets up shop in Whiskey Row, and she is there probably a couple of years before Prohibition kicks in. So it takes her a little while not only to set up shop in Whiskey Row, but the main thing that she's doing at this point in time is she's moving all of the whiskey to Kentucky and actually selling it out of Kentucky. And she remains there in the area and operating for about another 10 years. Our best guess is probably around 1916 is about as long as she operated in Whiskey Row. Louisa dies in, I believe, in 1918 is
Yep.
what we came up with, right? So a key figure in that period of time is Sam Broman. I'm going to say it that way because I looked it up and I listened to everybody pronounce that name. It is German. If I'm saying it wrong, hey, tough. So,
Oh, before you go there, I did want to bring up one point just
uh,
before we transition to Sam, was that when we were doing our research and everything got moved to Kentucky, we're looking up Greenbrier and Kentucky.
oh,
And so when you do that, if you happen to look it up yourself, you will find a different label that says of whiskey that says Greenbrier, but then it says Greenbrier, Kentucky, and turns out two totally separate distilleries.
made that mistake.
They are operating totally separate of each other. How these trademarks didn't get mad at each other, how they didn't feud, but it was not the same juice. There is actually a Greenbrier, Kentucky distillery that operated totally separate from Nelson's Greenbrier. So we looked into it. We had made the mistake and said we thought that's what Louisa had transitioned into. Turns
No.
out, no, it was totally different.
Well, and some other mystery about what was going on was specifically, how was Louisa selling that whiskey? And I'm sorry, I'm going to go back to the previous slide here. I'm going to try. I guess I'm not. Anyway, so if you were looking at the picture that had the whiskey bottles, the one on the far left was actually probably the most common way in which that whiskey would have been sold. And I would suggest that if you do find out that it's sold under a different brand, let us know because we couldn't find it.
Yeah.
But it was also being distributed in single-use bottles, at that point in time. So there was no bottling plant at the Greenbrier Distillery. And so I think that was another key step of moving to Kentucky was she didn't have the ability of supporting, packaging by bottle. And so that was a key thing they had in Kentucky itself. All right.
Yeah.
So back to the part of the story where Sam Broman steps in. Now, if you don't know Sam Broman, this is the king of Seagrams, what became Seagrams. So, but this is before a lot of that happened. Really interesting thing that Sam was doing at that point in time. You had Prohibition that was coming into play. And there was a similar conversation that was going on in Canada, but moving at a Canadian pace, not an American pace. So it happened in a different period of time. And so what was going on is that as whiskey was coming in higher demand, Sam was going around and buying up as much whiskey as he possibly could to bring into Canada at the time. And so while that was going really well and he was building, a large demand and distribution, the thing that he wasn't doing at the time was making his own whiskey. So Sam decides he's going on vacation, actually on his honeymoon, not a vacation. And I just thought this was such an interesting part of the storyline is that he decides to just go around and visit all of these, now defunct distilleries that are in place in the U.S. Can't make, liquor in the U.S. And while he's on his honeymoon, one of the key distilleries he decides to go and visit is Nelson Greenbrier. Walks into the place, and takes a look around at all the assets and sees this very iconic, still. And decides, sure, I'll buy it, makes an offer, we're guessing directly to Louisa or whoever was overseeing the property at that point in time, and buys the entire Nelson Greenbrier still at pennies on the dollar. So the easy thing would have been to do is to make whiskey there on site. Can't do that in the U.S. at that time. So he decides to arrange to have the entire still dismantled and shipped to Ontario, and specifically to a town called LaSalle. And so that's really how the direct connection is made between Sam and Nelson Greenbrier, is the purchase of this very iconic and very large still, and then bringing that back to Canada. So if some of the storyline, with the other things that's going on with Sam, during this period of time is that, again, it's more, more, more. I'm trying to buy all the whiskey. I'm trying to make all the whiskey that I possibly can. But the thing that he doesn't have is that he really doesn't have a brand that he can really count on. And so that's what's kind of eating at him is you have to really kind of get into the marketing game. And again, this is the transition between whiskey being sold by style and then whiskey being marketed and branded, at the same time. And so that was the piece of the equation that he was trying to navigate, but doing that, in Canada as well. So the this was the very first start of what was to become of the Seagram's empire. So the king comes to visit in Canada, and you have this really huge celebration that's going on, and Canadians are proud of the fact that they're part of the Commonwealth, but yet we speak French. I don't know why that works, but it does. I don't know if that's a way of them giving the finger to the king, or I'm really quite sure. Vive la France, Canada, yes, oui. I don't know, but anyway, it's a strange setup. Well, the thing is that Sam really wants to impress upon the king and the queen both visiting, and he wants to make a very iconic whiskey, and so he begins a process of going through a number of recipes, about 50 different recipes, to come up with a whiskey that he presents to the king and the queen during their visit. They love it so much that they're like, "You should make this. You have our blessing." And so he has a royal decree to actually make this whiskey from one of those recipes, and that wound up being Crown Royal. And the connection here directly with Nelson Greenbrier is that the LaSalle plant was one of several different distilleries that were using that whiskey to actually create Crown Royal. Now, there are other distilleries that were part of Sam's kingdom of whiskey at the time. You had the LaSalle plant, you have what's known as the Gimli plant, and then you have Waterloo, are three of the key plants that he was utilizing at that period of time. And it was actually a blend of whiskey from each of those places to be able to create Crown Royal. So that's how the direct connection gets from, Sam buys the distillery, takes it to Ontario, and winds up creating this very iconic blend now known as Crown Royal. So some other key things, as this part of the story is just the sheer size of what he is doing, as well. And I'm sure we'll have another story about everything around Sam, at some other point in time, because you really look at everything that was going on to create Seagram's. It's just mind-boggling the size and scale of what Sam ends up creating. But it's that still that came from Nelson Greenbrier that actually had enough volume to enable him to create, this huge whiskey empire. So, really fascinating, how all of this kind of came down, together and to really kind of create this storyline. Who would think that, a Tennessee whiskey, still would wind up making, Canadian whiskey and serving it to, the King of England? I mean, that's just, kind of unheard of. So, really hope you enjoyed our story about Nelson Greenbrier. And I want to acknowledge some key credits and some other sources for the storyline as well. Lance and I are just good consumers of other people's, written history and kind of putting the storyline together. So definitely take the time, enjoy reading all of the rich history in each of these areas. I know that both Lance and I just got the biggest kick, actually doing all the research behind this story.
Yeah, just there was so much that it's the classic case of I didn't know what I didn't know till I started finding out how much there was to learn, and it was just crazy to see all the connections and everything. Just as you turned one page, there was 10 more to kind of rabbit holes to go down.
Yeah, I really enjoyed putting the pieces of the puzzle together because this storyline is actually not written down in any one place, and so you really had to kind of approach it piecemeal to kind of get through the whole thing. Really hope you enjoyed this story featuring whiskey history at the Whiskey House. You can always drop us a line there at info@whouseinc.org, and we'll get back to you. For now, let's say goodbye, Lance.
Yeah, thanks so much. I appreciate this.
Hey, this is Mike Woods asking you to keep on sipping.